In the heart of a graduation ceremony, a moment of pure defiance unfolds. One woman, two guards, and an entire room of Marines standing up for what's right. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Anderson, a black officer, faces an unimaginable challenge when two security guards demand she leave, attempting to humiliate her in front of the audience. But this is more than just one woman's defiance. It's a powerful story of unity. The Marines, bound by loyalty, rise in solidarity to defend their sister in arms. What happens next is a stunning display of courage, resistance, and the fight for justice. Witness how one woman's strength sparks a movement that changes everything. This is a story you won't forget, of standing together for what's right. Before we dive into this powerful story, I think you missed one thing. Guess what? Like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of bravery and unity to light. Let's build a community that stands for justice, together. The atmosphere was electric in the grand auditorium, alive with the pride and joy of families, friends, and fellow officers. The air was thick with excitement and hope as the families watched their loved ones graduate from one of the most demanding programs in the military. It was a day that should have been a celebration of hard work, sacrifice, and triumph. Yet the events that transpired in the front row would leave everyone stunned and questioning the very fabric of authority and respect. Amidst the rows of polished uniforms and gleaming medals, one officer stood out like a beacon. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Anderson, a black woman, her impeccable uniform cut a sharp contrast against the sea of navy blue and white. Her dress uniform, perfectly pressed and adorned with medals earned through years of unyielding service, shimmered under the stage lights. There she sat, in the front row, an embodiment of resilience, strength, and professionalism. Her expression was calm, yet her presence commanded respect. But the spotlight was soon to be shifted from her achievements to something far more troubling. As the ceremony continued, the tension in the air built, but not for the reasons everyone expected. The graduates stood tall and proud as their names were called. Families cheered, cameras flashed, and there was an overwhelming sense of unity. But then it happened. Two security guards, both white and perhaps unfamiliar with the long history of service and sacrifice in the room, approached Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. Their steps were deliberate, almost menacing, as they walked towards her, pushing through the rows of seated attendees. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what was unfolding. The guard stopped just in front of Anderson, their eyes sharp with authority. Without even a word of greeting, one of the guards spoke loudly, "Ma'am, you need to leave." Now, the command was harsh, its tone filled with unwarranted aggression. For a moment, the auditorium was frozen in shock. How could this be happening? Why was a decorated officer being treated like a criminal in the middle of such a prestigious event? The very air seemed to grow thicker with disbelief, yet Karen Anderson remained unmoved. Her gaze never faltered. The calm in her eyes was powerful, almost defiant. Her body, poised and unshaken, seemed to reject the very authority the guards thought they wielded. There was no panic in her stance, no fear in her heart. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, an unwavering, unyielding strength. The guards, perhaps expecting resistance, prepared for a confrontation. But Lieutenant Colonel Anderson didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply looked them in the eye, her calm demeanor and silent defiance standing in stark contrast to the storm brewing around her. This was a moment of truth, and Karen Anderson was ready to face it head-on. What followed would change the course of this graduation ceremony forever. The guard's demands were sharp and clear. "Ma'am, you need to leave." Now, the words rang out like a challenge, cold and unyielding, carrying an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. It wasn't just a request. It was an order, one that dripped with undertones of prejudice. The room, once buzzing with excitement, fell into an eerie silence. A hushed stillness settled over the audience. You could almost hear a pin drop. Every eye was fixed on the unfolding drama, every ear straining to catch what would come next. The question that weighed on everyone's minds was simple. How could they possibly think they had the right to demand anything from someone like Colonel Anderson? She wasn't just any officer. She was a highly decorated, accomplished individual who had earned her place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And yet, here she was being treated with utter disrespect in the very space where her hard work should have been honored. What audacity, what nerve for anyone to challenge her authority in front of the entire graduating class, the families, and the entire military establishment. But Lieutenant Colonel Anderson didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady, focused on the guards with unwavering intensity. The command from the guards echoed through the room, yet it didn't rattle her. There was no fear in her posture, just quiet defiance. She sat upright, her back straight, her medals still gleaming in the spotlight. Everything about her body language screamed strength. She wasn't a woman to be intimidated. Not now, not ever. The guards, perhaps expecting her to crumble under the weight of their demand, took another step forward. Their hands hovered near her, their fingers twitching as though ready to force her to comply. The tension was unbearable. A sense of collective anticipation ran through the crowd. They didn't know if the situation would escalate into something violent or if Anderson would relent and allow them to humiliate her. The room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would unfold next. But just as it seemed like the guards were about to drag her out, something extraordinary happened, something that no one expected, least of all the guards. A slow ripple of movement began from the back of the room. It started with one Marine standing up, followed by another, and then another. It was subtle at first, almost like a quiet wave crashing over the crowd. But then, as if synchronized, the entire row of Marines standing near the back rose in unison, their bodies erect, their eyes locked forward with unwavering focus. Their presence was commanding, impossible to ignore. The guards faltered, their gaze shifting from Anderson to the growing number of Marines who were now standing with her. It wasn't just a few individuals. It was a show of strength, unity, and solidarity. In that moment, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson wasn't alone. She had the support of her brothers and sisters in arms, Marines who understood the sacrifice, the struggle, and the inherent dignity of one of their own. They didn't need to say a word. The very act of standing up together was more powerful than any spoken phrase could ever be. The guards were no longer the ones in control. The balance had shifted. The room, once filled with tension, was now charged with something far greater: unity. And it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just about one officer. This was about respect, about standing up for what's right. The audacity of the guards had unleashed something far more powerful than they had anticipated, an unspoken force of courage and solidarity that would change the course of this day forever. One by one, the Marines at the back of the auditorium began to rise, their movements slow but deliberate. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor filled the silence, breaking the tension that had gripped the room. It was a sound that resonated deeply, like the first drop of water in a quiet pond, creating ripples that would soon grow into something much more powerful. Each Marine stood tall, their uniforms sharp, their faces grim yet resolute. They formed a collective wall of unwavering support for Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. The first Marine to rise was Sergeant James Hill, a man known for his height, strength, and reputation for unwavering loyalty to his fellow soldiers. Hill was the embodiment of military integrity. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. His stance alone said everything. Standing tall, his back straight, and his posture firm, Hill locked eyes with the guards. The silent message was loud and clear: this is not okay. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost immediately. It wasn't just a display of support for one officer anymore. It was a bold stand for something far greater. The guards, who had once thought they held the upper hand, now found themselves the focus of a growing wave of defiance. The Marines' movements were fluid but powerful, and their eyes were all fixed on the guards with an intensity that made the tension palpable. Sergeant Hill was soon joined by other Marines. One after another, they rose from their seats, each adding to the strength of the growing movement. Corporals, lieutenants, sergeants, All stood with precision and authority, their bodies rigid and their eyes unwavering. With each Marine that stood, the room seemed to shift closer to something monumental. It wasn't just about an individual's act of rebellion anymore. It was about the very core values of the military. It was about loyalty, integrity, and respect for every individual who wore the uniform, regardless of the color of their skin. The guards began to squirm. What had once seemed like a simple act of enforcement now felt like a challenge they couldn't easily quell. Their eyes darted from a Marine in front of them to the growing sea of soldiers who stood in solidarity. The tension in the room was no longer just a product of the officer's aggressive stance. It was now about the defiance that was spreading like wildfire. Each Marine who stood made it harder for the guards to assert their authority. It was as if the entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting to see if the situation would escalate further or if the situation would de-escalate peacefully. The audience, having been on edge since the initial confrontation, now gasped in disbelief as the realization of what was happening settled in. What had started as an isolated act of discrimination was now a full-scale display of solidarity. The sound of gasps rippled through the crowd as more and more people began to understand the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. Some people instinctively reached for their phones, their hands shaking as they recorded the moment that was rapidly becoming something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. What was happening in that moment was no longer about a single officer or even the prejudice she had faced. It was about something deeper. It was about standing up against injustice, about showing that the military's core values transcended race, rank, and any kind of discrimination. It wasn't just a few Marines rising in defense of their fellow officer. It was a unified force, a wall of resilience, a display of strength and respect that no one could ignore. The room now pulsed with a collective power, and no one knew how it would end. But one thing was certain. The tide had shifted, and there was no going back. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation, so dense it almost seemed to suffocate the very life out of the room. The once vibrant energy had been replaced with a tense silence that hung over everyone present. Every eye was locked on the unfolding standoff. The guards, now realizing the weight of their mistake, stood uncomfortably in front of Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. They had expected compliance, an easy removal of an officer who had overstepped her bounds, but they had underestimated the situation entirely. One of the guards, clearly flustered by the resistance, tried once again to assert his authority, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is a violation of protocol," he barked, his words ringing through the space, desperate and defensive. The command was meant to shut the scene down, to reassert control, but it was futile. The Marines, their backs straight and their eyes unwavering, stood like an unyielding wall. They did not flinch. They did not blink. The words of the guard fell on deaf ears, as if they held no power over the situation anymore. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson remained seated, unbothered by the guard's attempts to regain control. Her composure was unshakable, and in that moment, her calmness radiated like a beacon of resistance. She locked eyes with the guards, her gaze piercing them like a sword through silk. It was a look that held a lifetime of strength, resilience, and wisdom, a gaze that spoke of the countless battles she had fought, not just on the battlefield, but in the face of every unjust system that had tried to suppress her. In that brief, powerful exchange, something changed in the air. It wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just a moment where one officer stood up to be heard. It was a declaration of defiance against every form of oppression, every act of injustice, and every time someone had been made to feel small because of who they were. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every person who had ever been silenced, every voice that had ever been drowned out by hate or prejudice. "I will not leave," she said, her voice steady and calm, but laced with undeniable power. The words were simple, yet profound. Not now. Not ever. The room fell into complete silence. It wasn't the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of sheer respect, of recognition, of realization. The audience held its collective breath, the tension so thick you could almost feel it press down on your chest. Who would blink first? Would the guards finally relent, or would they escalate this confrontation further? The power dynamics in the room had shifted completely. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's calm defiance had tilted the scales, and now she had the upper hand. The Marines stood their ground, unwavering. They had chosen their side. The audience, already in shock, was now witnessing a moment of historical significance. A stand not just for one individual, but for the values that the military and the nation were supposed to represent. The outcome of this moment, whatever it would be etched into the minds of all those present. It would be remembered for years to come, a symbol of strength, unity, and an unyielding fight for justice. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. As the room remained suspended in tension, the commanding officer, who had been silently observing the growing solidarity of the Marines and the unshaken dignity of Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, finally made his move. He could see it now, the immense courage and principle on display. This was no longer just an incident. It was a critical moment where honor, integrity, and respect were at stake. With a stern yet understanding voice, he stepped forward and gave a command that would forever alter the course of the ceremony. "Guards," he said firmly, "stand down." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of justice. The commanding officer's voice cut through the silence, and the guards, who had been standing with rigid authority, now found themselves in a vulnerable position. Their faces flushed crimson, their posture sagged with humiliation. They stood frozen, unable to defend their actions. The gravity of their mistake was now clear to everyone in the room. They had not only disrespected an officer, but had unwittingly challenged the values that the military held sacred: unity, loyalty, and fairness. The room, once thick with tension, now erupted in a wave of applause. The sound started softly, as if the audience wasn't quite sure if it was okay to react, but it quickly grew in strength. Hands clapped and cheers filled the air as people stood up, applauding not only Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, but the entire display of solidarity. The audience, which had once been eerily silent, now had a chance to release their collective emotions, and they did so with overwhelming support. The applause wasn't just for Anderson. It was for every person who had ever been pushed aside or made to feel inferior, for every individual who had fought against adversity and stood their ground, never giving in to the pressures of an unjust world. It was a moment of recognition for everyone who had struggled to make their voice heard in a world that often tried to silence them. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, her face still calm, but now illuminated by the spotlight of support, slowly stood up. The lights seemed to catch her medals once more, casting them in a glow that symbolized all the years of sacrifice and dedication she had poured into her service. With a quiet strength, she walked toward the stage, her head held high, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep sense of pride. Pride in herself, in the Marines who had stood by her side, and in the principles she had defended. Flanked by the Marines who had supported her in this moment of truth, Anderson's step was steady and unyielding. The crowd parted for her as she walked, every eye following her movement, every heart beating in solidarity. This graduation would be remembered for one simple reason. It was a moment when people chose to stand up for what was right. The bravery and unity displayed here would be immortalized in the hearts of those who witnessed it, a story of standing against injustice, of unity over division, and of the unwavering power of collective support. This wasn't just the graduation of an officer. It was the graduation of a movement. It was a moment that proved, once again, that no one, no matter their background, their race, or their story, should ever be made to feel small. And as Lieutenant Colonel Anderson stood before the audience, with her head held high and her future as bright as her medals, the ceremony's true purpose was clear. This was about honor. This was about standing up, not just for oneself, but for the greater good. And it was a moment that would live on in the memories of all who witnessed it for years to come. This wasn't just a story of one woman's defiance. It was a story of unity, courage, and the unbreakable strength that comes when people stand together in the face of injustice. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Anderson's actions transcended her individual struggle. She became a beacon of something much larger. Her defiance wasn't just about resisting authority. It was about rejecting the systems that have historically silenced, marginalized, and oppressed people simply because of their race, their background, or their identity. In that moment, Anderson stood not only for herself, but for every person who had been unfairly dismissed, belittled, or oppressed. She became more than just an officer that day. She became a symbol of resistance. Resistance not only to the guards who had attempted to humiliate her, but to a wider culture of inequality that too often goes unnoticed or unchallenged. Her refusal to bow down to discrimination and her unwavering calm under pressure turned her into an icon of dignity. In the midst of the chaotic scene, she stood resolute, demonstrating that true strength isn't just physical. It's the courage to fight for what is right, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Through her, the world witnessed the power of standing firm in one's beliefs. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's act of resistance inspired a collective uprising of solidarity, not only from the Marines who supported her, but from the audience who recognized the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't about one woman confronting a couple of guards. It was about confronting an entire history of systemic inequality and the ways in which it manifests even in the most prestigious of spaces. In that moment, Anderson embodied pride. She wasn't just proud of her service, her rank, or her accomplishments. She was proud of the community that had rallied behind her, proud of the Marines who understood that true honor lies in standing up for justice, and proud of the values she had fought for throughout her career. It was a pride that radiated from her, not in arrogance, but in a quiet, powerful conviction that she had done something that mattered. Her courage in that room became a symbol of the enduring fight for equality. It was a reminder that the battle for justice doesn't end with one victory, one protest, or one stand. It continues every day, in every action, in every moment when we choose to do what's right, no matter the consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's bravery inspired everyone around her to rise above fear, to reject injustice, and to unite in the fight for what is fair and right. She didn't just wear the uniform that day. She embodied it fully, with every ounce of strength and honor it stood for. And in the years to come, her name would not only be remembered as an officer, but as a symbol of what it means to resist, to fight for what's right, and to stand proudly in the face of adversity. Her story would be told and retold, not as a mere account of one woman's experience, but as a testament to the enduring power of unity, the importance of courage, and the tireless fight for equality. If you were inspired by this incredible moment, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and justice. We bring you content that will not only entertain you, but leave you thinking long after the video ends. Don't miss out. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a powerful story. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can share these powerful moments of change and hope. Subscribe now and stand with us in the fight for what's right.